Hello. So today we're going to start going over some of the individual gods and goddesses in the Hindu pantheon. So our first god is Brahma. And Brahma, remember, is part of our Trimurti, the Hindu Trinity. And Brahma is the god of creation. So once the universe, remember we said the universe sort of emanates out from Brahman. Be very careful also, just a side note, be very careful with spelling here because we've been introduced to Brahman, M-A-N. Right now we're being introduced to Brahma, and then later on we'll learn about Brahmin, which are the high caste in Hinduism. So be very careful with the spelling. So once the universe emanates out from Brahman, Brahma takes over as the god of creation. So Brahma is the god who creates our individual world and humanity and living beings within it. And creation is rather an important aspect of divinity, but kind of surprisingly, Brahma is not that popular anymore. This is why Prothero, when he talks about the Hindu Trimurti, he says that the real Trimurti today is Vishnu, Shiva, and Mahadevi. Because Brahma has so sort of fell out of favor or fell out of popularity, not many people are devotees of Brahma. He's just simply not that popular as a god anymore. But theologically, he's still important, so we do want to learn about him. You might notice here in this image of Brahma that he has 4 heads. And Brahma is always depicted with 4 heads because he's considered the author of the Vedas. So remember, we talked about the Vedas already. They are the most sacred text in Hinduism and the earliest text in Hinduism. And we mentioned that the Vedas are not just one text, they're multiple texts. And there are 4 main Vedas. So the Vedas are divided into 4 main sections. So Brahma has 4 heads because he's the author of the Vedas, and each one of his heads is constantly reciting one of those Vedas. So the origin story for how human beings got the Vedas is actually that these individuals known as rishis or seers, sort of wise holy men, that they were able to hear the words of the Vedas. They could just hear these sounds, these words in the air, and then they wrote them down. So that's why the Vedas are sacred. They do have a divine origin, and that origin is Brahma. So Brahma, each one of his heads is constantly reciting the Vedas. They just start at the beginning, go through it, and then immediately start over. So Brahma always has 4 heads because of his connection to the Vedas. He's the author of the Vedas. So God of creation and the author of the Vedas, but he's not that popular as a god anymore. He is not widely worshipped in India or within Hinduism today. But even though he's not that popular, his female consort, or his wife, is Saraswati, and she is much more popular than he is. So we mentioned that Hinduism does have a strong aspect of the divine feminine, of these female goddesses. And it's important to know that oftentimes the goddesses can be more popular than the gods, as in this case, Saraswati, much more popular than Brahma. And it's not necessarily divided up by gender, right? So it's not like, male Hindus worship male gods and female Hindus worship female goddesses. Both of them cut across the gender divide, right? Which individual gods or goddesses that you're devoted to has more to do with your family history, tradition, and oftentimes personal choice, but it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't divide up that way. So there are lots of male devotees of Saraswati, for example, and male and female devotees of Brahma or Saraswati. So it doesn't necessarily, mean that only women are worshiping these goddesses. So that's important to note. So Saraswati is the goddess of creativity and the goddess of knowledge. So we'll also see as we go through the 3 gods of the Trimurti and their female consorts, which each are a representation of Mahadevi. They are sort of in charge of similar areas of the world. They have similar powers. So just as Brahma is the god of creation, Saraswati is the goddess of creativity. So they're linked to each other. They're connected to each other in that way. as I mentioned, so she's the goddess of creativity and knowledge. So she is someone who has power over those pursuits. So you can see in her representation here, instead of having 4 heads, she has 4 arms. And usually as she's depicted, each one of her hands is holding an instrument of creativity or knowledge. So she's oftentimes shown as she is here with a musical instrument. She's oftentimes shown with like a paintbrush or a pen, because these are all creative pursuits, right? So making music, writing literature, writing poetry, making jewelry. She has a necklace here. So she's in charge of these areas. And so oftentimes actually artists will be devoted to her. So I said sometimes it can also be a personal choice which god or goddess you're devoted to. So a musician or a writer or a painter, someone like that, might ask Saraswati for her help because she is the goddess of creativity. She's also got the goddess of knowledge, and so oftentimes students are also devoted to her because she helps them with that. Her depiction here with the 4 arms, also important to note, that's a representation of omnipotence and omnipresence, right? So we'll notice in these images of the Hindu gods and goddesses that there's always something about them that sort of denotes that they're not just a regular human being, even though they do look similar to human beings, right? They have multiple limbs, they can have, different colored skin, something that sort of makes them stand out as a god or a goddess. She's also depicted with her foot on a lotus flower here. And an important thing to know is that the lotus, the image of the lotus, is very important in Hinduism and Buddhism because of how the lotus grows. The lotus is a beautiful flower, and it usually grows in a pond. It grows on top of muddy water. So the lotus becomes a symbol in Hinduism and Buddhism of sort of ethics and morals, right? That just as the lotus flower can sort of rest on top of all this murky, muddy, dirty water and become this beautiful flower, we too should be able to sort of rise above the circumstances of the suffering of the world, right? That we can rest on top of that suffering, and we can achieve liberation. So that's why you'll see a lot of images of lotuses throughout Hinduism and also when we get to Buddhism. So this is Saraswati, goddess of creativity and knowledge, and I think I mentioned already that because of that, oftentimes students are devoted to her. So oftentimes people in your situation would be a devotee of Saraswati because she helps with the learning process. Okay,